Hello again, we're here this afternoon to talk about Engine 21, continuation of the foam series that we've been doing this month. Engine 21, engine out of the Main Street station, straightforward structural pumper, 1250 gallon minute pump, 750 gallons of water, 50 gallon onboard foam tank. Also has the unique capability of being able to do pumping and rolling at the same time. Can move itself forward while it's pumping water, or its primary mission is to pump foam. This truck is a little bit different than the other trucks in our fleet. It's different than Engine 25, which we've covered, although they both do have 50 gallon onboard foam tanks. Engine 25, you remember, is one dedicated foam line. That's all you're going to get. Every other line is water. But this particular truck, when you're in the foam mode, it's either all foam or all water. There's no mixing of the two. Once you go to a foam operation, this is called an around-the-pump proportioner. The foam drains right into the top of the pump housing, and that's where the foam is mixed, where the concentrate is mixed with the water, turned into finished foam as it comes out the nozzle. So that there's some little idiosyncrasies to this truck that we need to know based on that. We'll start up in the cab. A couple of things that we need to know up in the cab. This particular truck. First and foremost, if you can see right here, is the pump switch. This truck operates off of power takeoff. It's the only truck in our fleet that does that, because this truck can pump and roll. This is to put this truck in the pump, simply a question of throwing the switch on. That's all it takes. You can do it while you're moving, you can do it while you're going up the highway, although that's not recommended. But if you're at a very slow speed, let's say you're pulling up to any particular fire, 5-10 miles an hour, you can go ahead and throw the pump in. Doesn't really have any effect on the remainder of the operation. That's all it takes to put the truck in. This particular truck, because it's a power takeoff or stationary pumping or a structural fire or any type of routine fires that we do, the truck pumps in neutral. It's not like the other trucks where the transmission has to change gears. You have to change the transmission to drive the pump housing as opposed to the rear wheels. Very simple operation. That's how they gauge the pump. The other capability that this truck does have, because it's designed to pump and roll, it does have ground sweeps left and right side of the bumper. Decided to put a foam blanket out in front of the truck. In a very unlikely event that you were driving through a flaming blanket in an attempt to suppress that fire, there's a switch in the cab for the ground sweeps that we'll show you. It also has the roof on the turret, designed to put a significant amount of water or a significant amount of foam, 500 gallons a minute, out the turret, a fair distance out in front of the truck. Also can be used for pumping and rolling. Realistically, you're probably going to be using that in a stationary situation where you pull up to a particular fire and park the truck and operate the roof turret from inside, which goes on the inside, which we'll show you, and flow foam out in front. What we'll do now is go up into the cab. There's a couple of switches up there we'll go over. We'll talk about the process for pumping and rolling. Real quick about pumping and rolling. Like I said, it's unlikely that you're ever going to really pump and roll. It's unlikely that you're going to move through a blanket of flammable liquid that you're trying to foam, but there are some things that we need to know if we are going to pump and roll. There's 3 switches down here on the bottom of the dashboard, and also a primer. There's mirror images of these switches out on the pump panel that we'll go over. There's a foam switch that opens up the valve, opens up the adductor. There's a tank to pump switch right here that you can throw up. Tank to pump, just like it says. This has got the red light on it because this is the actual foam switch. Once this switch goes up, you're making foam. So it's labeled like this. So for training purposes, you can open up, you can use all of these switches. Just don't want to use this one. Once this switch is up, you're making foam. In order to turn them off, to shut them down, it's just a drop-down cover. This truck does have a primer in the cab. You can prime the truck from the cab if for some reason you should lose your prime. It does have a primer, and it also has a pressure gauge, discharge gauge. We want to remember that we want to be pumping about 200 psi to make good foam. So there's a couple of things that we need to know to do that if we are going to pump and roll. First step, obviously, we want to make sure our pump is in to pump and roll. The next thing we want to make sure is that the Jake brake gets turned off. Both of these switches get dropped down. We're going to drop our transmission down into first gear. We want to stay in first gear. For the purposes of pumping and rolling, your right foot on the fuel pedal is what controls the RPMs of the truck. We want to drop this down into first gear so that the truck's not shifting through the gears as we're pumping and rolling. Our switches go in the up position. Once that's done, we can get on the gas pedal, control the turret from here. It's got to get unlocked like this, left to right, up and down, and this controls the pattern between a bit of a fog and a bit of a straight stream. So once we've done that, we've got our tank to pump open, we've got our two foam switches open, truck's in first gear, we're off to pumping and rolling. You want to maintain about 12 miles an hour forward speed. The passenger can keep an eye on this once you're up to about 200 psi, and that's what we need to do. Like I said, the chances of us really doing that in the real world are pretty slim. More than likely, the situation you're going to find yourself with is using this in a stationary type operation. And it's really not that different, except that we have the uniqueness of being able to use the throttle, engine RPM throttle, to get up to our 200 psi from the cab. We want to make sure the pump is in, we want to make sure our truck is in neutral, and we want to make sure that this switch, it's now in panel, transfers electronically over to this throttle. Now we can use this throttle to bring our engine RPMs up. This throttle is an electronic actuator. It's about a quarter of a turn from idle to redline. So it's a little bit different than the throttles that we're used to using. Quarter turn from idle to redline. There is occasionally in the course of an operation, in the course of the day, people get in and out of here. This switch should be left in the panel position. If this switch is in the cab position, it disables the throttle that's on the pump panel. So if you get to a routine type of fire, whether, anything you're going to just flow water on, your pump is in, and you're out there with the panel, and you're turning the throttle up to generate engine RPMs, and that throttle doesn't seem to be doing anything, it's possible that this is in the cab position. It's something that needs to be checked in the morning. It should be left in the panel position all the time, but occasionally it does, rarely get left in the cab position. You want to make sure, if you're throttling the pump panel, if you're out 10 or 13 turns, and it's not speeding up, you need to come in here, make sure you throw this back to panel. It's important to note, if you do find yourself at the pump panel with the throttle many turns out and the engine RPMs aren't coming up, you need to turn the throttle back in before you throw this from cab to panel. If you don't, you're going to have, whatever that throttle is turned out, on the flick of a switch, all of those engine RPMs are going to transfer to the panel, the pump panel throttle, and you're going to have a huge spike in pressure. So you want, before you come in here and throw this over from cab to panel, you want to make sure that your throttle is back in. So now what we can do, we'd also do real quick, there was a switch here for the ground sweeps that we talked about. If you're going to pump and roll, there's a low rocker switch right here, just like every other rocker switch. It's labeled. Throw that up. That sends water to the ground sweeps. So what we'll do now is come around, we'll go to the pump panel. There's a couple intricacies on the pump panel we'll talk about. We'll talk a little bit more about this truck's capability as far as foam goes. Ground sweep switch, just like a regular roll rocker. Engine 21's pump panel. We just covered the stuff that's in the cab, and there's some things out here that are unique to this truck that we need to know about. This truck is preset in the morning to do pump and roll, which means it's preset to do 500 gallons a minute out of the turret at 200 psi pump discharge pressure. That means that this particular relief valve is preset for 200 psi as opposed to 150 psi on all of our other trucks. We remember that on engine 25, in order to go to a foam operation, we need to crank this up above 200. Now this being engine 21 is just the opposite. This is preset at 200. So in a regular structural operation or a regular water operation, we need to adjust this down. This is the one relief valve in the town that's not preset at 150. It's preset at 200. It does have a water level indicator right here and a foam level indicator. Some of the other things out here that are unique to this truck, the same three switches that are in on the dashboard are back here on the pump panel. Foam ejector switch right here opens up the valve at the top of the pump. Tank to pump switch right here. We use this all the time routinely every time this truck pumps water. Every other truck in the fire department, it's a pull-out valve. In this truck, it's an air-actuated electronic switch. and also the foam tank. Open up this button, opens the valve, gets foam out of the tank into the top of the pump. This truck, as we talked about, it's all or nothing. Once this switch is thrown up, all you're going to do is make foam. It means foam is going to come out of every discharge that you operate. And we need to know, there's a couple of reasons that we need to know that, primarily at the end when it comes time to having a flush. The metering valve on this truck, made by Williams, I'm not sure if you can see this on the video, it's two different colors, blue and black. The blue settings are 3%, and the black settings are for 6%. This truck is preset for 500 gallons a minute, 3% foam, we're primarily concerned with hydrocarbons. Also, you can see it's preset at 500 gallons a minute. Preset to pump and roll. If you're not pumping and rolling, if you're a stationary operation, this valve needs to be adjusted to whatever gallons per minute you're flowing. If you've got one hand line off, you're only pumping 100 gallons a minute or so, this valve can be turned. It does have little indents at 500, 250 at each setting, but you can adjust it in the middle. If you're flowing 200 gallons a minute, you can adjust this valve to somewhere between 120 and 250, somewhere you think 200 would be, that's not a problem. So just because it does have indents, it doesn't mean it has to be left on an indent. You can adjust this anywhere that you need to. And like I said, this should be in the morning. This truck is preset to pump and roll, so it's left at 500 gallons per minute. There's a couple other intricacies of this particular truck. If you are pumping foam, as long as the pump housing is spinning, the pump is going to draw foam out of the foam tank. So the engineer, the pump operator, needs to be aware if the nozzle is closed for any length of time, you want to shut this foam line down. You don't have to eagle eye the nozzle every time the nozzleman shuts his line down to shut the foam off, but if you're in an overhaul operation or you're doing vapor suppression and not really actively engaged in firefighting, and you're going to use some foam and then shut the nozzle down and leave it on the ground for a minute or 2 minutes or 3 minutes or longer, you're going to want to shut the foam off. Because like I said, as long as the pump housing is spinning, it's drawing foam out of the tank. And if you sit at idle and not flowing any foam for any length of time, you can draw 30 or 40 or 50 gallons of foam into the pump housing, and then you've exhausted your foam tank. It's not something, you don't have to constantly do it every time the nozzleman closes the nozzle, but it's going to be, if it's going to be for any length of time that you're not flowing foam, you want to go ahead and shut this switch off. This truck also has the unique unique to this truck is a direct tank fill, so that a supply line can go directly into the tank. This truck is, because it's designed to pump and roll, it's designed to make foam out of the tank. You can use the regular intake for a foam operation, it's not a problem. But there's some things that we need to know about. In the perfect world, if you're going to lay a supply line, if you know you're going to a foam operation, you're going to go right to foam, you're going to want to take your supply line and put it directly into this direct to tank fill. It's a nurse valve, and you can find a balance between what's going in and what's going out. If you know you're going right to foam, that's fine. In the real world is that a lot of times we're at an incident already pumping water, boats, fiberglass, some sort of hazmat thing, and you've got your supply line already in your intake, and now you're going to go to foam. This metering valve works just fine off of this intake. However, there is one kind of trick. There has to be a 50 psi difference between what's going out and what's coming in order for the Williams valve, the metering valve, to work. All that means is that you just have to have at least 50 psi difference. We know that we're probably going to be pumping at 200 psi pump discharge pressure. That would mean no more than 150 psi coming in. If you've on a really good hydrant, 150 psi coming in would be rare. Or if you're being resupplied from another pumper, you need to make sure that there's no more than 150 psi coming in, whether that be by gating back or having the pumper that's relaying up to you gate back, so that there is a 50 psi difference. Once you're making foam with this truck, every valve that you open is going to get foam. Everything. So there's some things if we're making foam that we don't want to do. We don't want to open our tank fill. That's going to contaminate this tank with foam. It can be kind of a mess. It is a good waste of foam. We don't want to use any of our pump coolers, any of our engine coolers It will work okay pumping foam through it, but it's a real pain to have to flush. So we want to avoid, if possible, opening any of these cooler valves. It's not a deal breaker if you do. If you do have to use it to cool the pump or to cool the engine, it's okay. You just got to remember, which we talked about earlier, foam is very, very corrosive. And everything, once you make foam with this truck, it requires a tremendous amount of flushing. Anything that comes in contact with foam needs to get flushed. So if we do open these valves, we have to make sure that they're sufficiently flushed before we put the truck back in service. We also have to be sure that, because once this pump is engaged and spinning, water under pressure is pushed up against every valve that comes off the pump housing. So when we make foam, there's going to be a little bit of foam behind every one of these. So every one of these needs to get drained with fresh water and flushed pretty well before the truck goes back to service, including the deck gun bleeders. And most importantly, around on the other side, there was a bleeder like this for the turret. That's the high point in the system. So some foam is going to get pushed up against that. We want to make sure we drain that, bleed it, and flush them as much as we possibly can until the water runs clear. But we get every valve is going to have foam up against it because the pump's engaged. We do have the capability with this truck. Engine 21 does have an aerating nozzle, which we should use for our automatic nozzles. And it also has an old-fashioned pickup tube and 2 5-gallon foam canisters in the back. The reason being is it gives you an option of, if you've got just a small routine vapor suppression situation with a small pile of gasoline where you don't want to go through the hassle of foaming the whole truck, you can just go back to the old-fashioned way, pull a line off, and use a can and use the pickup tube to just do a small routine operation so that you're not having to foam the whole truck and flush the whole truck, because it can be kind of a pain. So we do have that capability if we decide that's what we want to do. Also with an aerating nozzle. One other thing with this truck, it does have a 50-gallon foam tank on board. You do have the option, if you're at a large-scale, long-term evolution, similar to what engine 25 has. It does have an auxiliary foam pickup tube that's stored up here that goes into a regular chemical connection right here. If you're going to utilize the auxiliary foam pickup tube, rather than hump cans up to the top and spike them into the top of the foam tank, you can set up that operation right here. All you need to do, snap your auxiliary foam pickup tube on, like I said, regular chemical connection, close the foam switch, and open the auxiliary foam pickup tube switch, and that just, instead of picking up foam from that tank, it's going to pick up foam from this tank. It's your option. If you've got the manpower and the resources to dump the foam in on the top, you can do that. If not, you can just do it this way. Just to be familiar, this is the quarter-turn drain for the turret. If you do make foam, you want to make sure that this is one of the last things that you do. It's the high point on the truck, and it's a nice low drain, so you want to make sure that any foam that got up against the turret gets drained out, and it's a little bit hidden under here. It's a quarter-turn valve, like every quarter-turn valve on the truck. Real quickly, we're going to review engine 21. Unique in that it has the capability to pump and roll. It's the only fire truck in our arsenal that has the capability of doing that, and that makes it unique. It's an around-the-pump proportioner, which means that when you're making foam with this truck, it's all foam or all water. And you just need to be aware of that, mostly because when you're done at the end of a foam operation, everything's going to need to get flushed. Every valve, every discharge is going to have some foam up against it. It needs to get drained, it needs to get flushed. Most likely to use the roof turret for a foam operation is going to be done in the stationary mode. So you need to be familiar with the switches up in the cab, and we also need to be familiar with the transfer switch that transfers power from the throttle that's in the cab to the throttle that's on the pump panel. Should be left in the pump panel mode. Occasionally you will, very rarely, but you will find that that switch gets knocked by somebody's knee. And if you come out to your regular structure fire, regular fire suppression, you turn your throttle up on the pump panel, and it doesn't bring up the engine RPMs, you need to be conscious of the fact that it's possible that that transfer switch in the cab is in the cab position. You don't want to run up to the cab and just throw that switch back to transfer power back to the pump panel, because now that's 12 or 13 turns out. All of that pressure is gonna spike out into whatever line that you have right off your truck. We do have the capability of going through, there are 2 5-gallon cans of foam back here with a pickup tube. If you get a small routine incident, you don't want to go through the aggravation of foaming the whole truck, you do have the option of using cans and a pickup tube and just going through the old-fashioned way. We want that ejector to be at least 100 feet from the nozzle, so they get enough time to get the nice mixture as it's progressing down the line out to the nozzle, and we also do have that capability.